Okay, now let's actually start looking at our topic for the class, which is sustainability. And what I want to do in this lecture is just give you a little bit of an overview of what sustainability is, some of the terms we'll be looking at, and then a little bit about what ancient people have to say about sustainability. And of course, the big question is, what is sustainability? So it's something we really need to discuss first before talking about anything else. And what I've done here is given you a very simple definition of sustainability, and that's trying to secure present needs without compromising future generations. Now, even though that sounds like it's really talking about the present, that can certainly be used for any place in the ancient world that has human civilization. So that's really what sustainability is, making sure you don't use up what we have now from the natural world, which might compromise what future people end up doing. And I've given you a YouTube video link here, which I know you cannot click on, but you can find the link on the syllabus. It's a really good video. It's probably about 3 minutes that talks a little bit about what sustainability is. And then as we dig deeper into sustainability in the ancient world, we'll see that just like in the present, there are 3 kinds of sustainability that we can talk about, and which we will talk about in this class. One, of course, is environmental, which I think most people know about. It's making sure we don't use up so many of the world's resources that there's nothing left for later. There's also social sustainability. And if you really think about it, all life on this planet is based on the environment. So the sun shines, we get plants, we eat the plants, animals eat the plants, and then we eat the animals, and so on. Now, social sustainability is really about equality in social groups, making sure that everyone has equal access to various resources of the planet. And then related to that is economic sustainability. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the class. For our purposes, really what we're talking about is, and I have a slide talking about this at the very end, this cycle where you've got people growing food, you get a leader in the ancient world. The leader wants more resources, so he demands more food, and it's this cycle, sometimes which ends in a really bad way. But that's really what economic sustainability is again, making sure you don't use more of your resources than you have to sustain your economy. And I've given you another link, and again, I know you can't watch that, but the link is on the syllabus and it's titled, What is Sustainability? Now, I have a long quote here. What you'll need to do is actually turn the video off or pause it and read through this. And this is just talking a little bit about the human impact on our planet. It goes through a number of different things, like how we change the actual surface of the planet, the use of water cycles, nitrogen cycles, which simply put is the use of or overuse of fertilizers on the ground, which of course gives us more plants, but it does a terrible thing to the actual nitrogen cycle that was there before we started using fertilizers, and so on. So it's worth pausing the video, reading through the quote. Okay, and we just talked a little bit about the water. The use of water is one of the 6 main ways that humans impact the planet. And I thought what I'd do really quickly here is just give you a view of what the simplified water cycle is. And I'm sure you've all seen this before. Let me get my little pen here. So starts off with ocean or bodies of water. You get water vapor turning into clouds. This, of course, goes to rain, which falls on the mountains or falls wherever. It gets used by plants, cycles through the earth, and then goes out to water. Now, I think one thing that this simplified water cycle really does not talk about is how much the water can actually influence the rest of this cycle. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about something called the 8,200 BP event. Now, BP stands for before present. And what we'll see is the way that scientists start before present is 1950 for whatever reason. So it's 1950 years before 8,200. So it's about 6,000 BC, really. That's really what it's talking about. But what happened during that period is that the Atlantic Ocean cooled. And then this really affected evaporation rates. It really affected rainfall in various places, which of course affects the entire water cycle. So it's a really interesting example of how something far away can influence a number of things. Another thing I wanted to talk about, we see this quite a bit in modern discussions about what weather and what climate is. You might hear someone say in the middle of winter, oh, it's such a cold winter, haha, there's no global warming. Whether that's true or not, what we should be careful with is how we use our terms. So in one of our books by Hughes on page 222, he gives a really good example of the difference between weather and climate. And we experience weather on a day-to-day basis. So today where I'm at, it's fairly chilly and sunny. So that, of course, adds to 365 days of weather and these cycles. But today or over the coming weeks, where I am right now, it's supposed to snow. So that's weather. That's not necessarily climate. So for our purposes, climate is something that happens over a long period of time, like a year, as I put here, several years, a decade, or a century, or even more, especially since we're looking at the ancient world. So that's a big difference. So whether this winter is very cold and we get little snow may have or may not have an impact on climate change in general. I give you another long quote here, and again, what you need to do, I'm not going to read it to you, you'll need to pause the video, is it talks about how sustainability is not something that just started up in the 1960s. This is something that people have been concerned about for a very long time. They react to it and understand it differently than what we do in the ancient world, but it's certainly something that people have had to deal with for a very long time and have thought about it for a very long time. So go ahead and pause the video, read through the quote. Okay, so you're probably asking yourself, can we even talk about sustainability in the ancient world? And of course, our entire class is about this. So of course, the answer is yes. And then what you might really want to start thinking about is, what do ancient people say about their climate and their environment? And are they aware, like we are, of damage to the environment, say when you overforest, when you cut down a whole bunch of trees and it leads to erosion and lots of problems downstream? And the answer is definitely yes. Ancient people knew about damage they were doing, and sometimes they tried to stop it and sometimes they didn't. So I just want to look at a few ideas that are out there. We'll be looking at these in much more detail as the class goes on, but in terms of earlier versions of what people thought about in terms of sustainability, we can look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible for some religious ideas that really have an impact on how we think about the environment. So if you look at the very beginning of Genesis, you'll see there's two versions of how people deal with their environment. One I've listed here is humans above nature. So you get the statements in the Hebrew Bible, quote, let him rule over the fish of the sea and the animals and so on. So that puts humans at an elevated level above nature. They control nature, they dominate it. Then you also get a second view in Genesis, in the creation story, where humans are from nature. So you get the story about how God formed people out of this, or man out of the soil of the earth, and blew life into him. So people come from nature in this particular example. So here you get two ideas about the place of people in the environment. You also get this idea of a lost golden age, and this is fairly common in a lot of civilizations, where the Garden of Eden, where everything is growing, everything is plentiful, it's a long time ago, and then people come and somehow mess it up. And in the Old Testament story, Adam and Eve are ejected, and then they have to till the soil, and it's a lot of work to do that. You also get similar stories in the Greek and Roman world. And I put pagan here. You have to be careful with that particular term. It just means non-Christian in this particular case, where you have geographical spaces that were special. You see this in the Greek and Roman world all over, where there are various gods and goddesses that are controlling various geographical places, like a special god or goddess for a grove of trees. And so that tells us that there's something special about that grove of trees because there's a god or goddess looking over it. And if you look deeper, you'll also see that they believed in the lost golden age of almost like a Garden of Eden, where everything was better, everything was brighter, things grew better, and so on in the ancient world. Now, moving up into the classical period for Greece, you can look at a number of different quotes from the Greeks and what they thought about their environment. And I will say, I think I say this on the next slide, I will give you a document of a whole bunch of primary sources. So again, a primary source are documents written by ancient people on what they have to say on their environment. So I'm not going to read these to you. So what you need to do is pause the video and read through them. But I will say first is that you have Plato talking about the rise and fall of civilizations and how climate may influence that. So that's actually pretty interesting. And then you've got Aristotle, who talks about processes of the earth taking part over a whole time, and these may not be something that we can see. So this is the difference between weather and climate. So the same type of thing. Anyway, go ahead and pause the video and read these two quotes. You can also find lots of quotes from the Romans on where man sits in terms of their environment. And here's a fairly famous quote by Cicero that talks about man being the highest in the scale, who's above the land, above the animals, who creates technology, and so on. So go ahead and stop the video and read through this quote. Okay, I had mentioned this before on various sources of information when I was talking about what is history in general. So there's lots of information that we can pull from to determine what the environment was like in the ancient world. And so you've got pollen studies. Now, these can show us what plants were growing over time. So what we'll see in a lot of cases, you have like the pollen of native plants. And all of a sudden, you'll see pollen levels go down, and then others will increase, like the pollen of beans, say. Just pulling that out of my head. That might tell us that people cut down the native plants, and now they're growing a crop that they can eat. So we can look at pollen for that. You can also look at charcoal. So when people burn wood, the leftover remains as charcoal, and scientists can study that for when it was burned and the type of tree, in our case, what type of tree it was coming from. And so this is really interesting when you think about deforestation or chopping down trees. You can look at charcoal levels over time and see what happens and what trees people are burning. And when they get to a point where they're not burning any trees or they're burning a different type of tree, it might tell us something about the environment. You also have archaeology, which is anything that people build. So human remains, that's not what people build, but human remains and things that people worked on. We can also look at ice cores and seabed sediments to tell us what was going on. I'll have you read an article about lead levels in Arctic ice that come from the time of the Romans and the Greeks. And I've mentioned seabed sediments here twice. You can also find this list in one of our textbooks for this class. Okay, now I just went through this list of sources, and on this last slide, I just want to make you aware of the limitations of these sources. So when you get textual sources, like I showed you quotes from Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, you have to think about what they're saying, why they're saying, who's saying it, and when they're saying it. So you have to think about all these things because there could be people are biased and they could say things for specific reasons. So we want to make sure we don't trust these sources 100%. And of course, there's archaeological limitations. In some places, you don't get pollen levels, or there may not be enough trees to produce charcoal, or maybe there was charcoal and there was a flood and it washed it all away. Anyway, so you don't want to trust these sources 100%. So, and I mentioned this before on, what exactly is history? It's really the interpretation of things by historians, and in this case, the historians will be you. So we use the evidence that we have to try and make an educated guess about what happened in the past.